Good evening. My name is Shareen Young Chavez, and thank you for joining us tonight for this edition of From Disability to Disability. Each week for the next 3 weeks, we're going to be bringing you topics as it relates to our special needs community. We're focusing on services, providers, and advocacy in general. Last week, we had the privilege of having Mr. Larry Barnett join us, who is the Democratic candidate running for delegate in the 27th District in Chesterfield County. We talked about why it was so important to speak with our elected officials and those running for positions about our special needs interest. We had the pleasure of speaking with Ms. Heidi Lawyer, who is the Executive Director for the Virginia Board for People with Disabilities. We talked about why advocacy was so important to her and why it was important for her to provide opportunities to the public to develop their own advocacy skills. We also had the pleasure of speaking with Jane Warwick, the founder of A Playground for Katie and Friends, Central Virginia's first inclusive playground. Tonight's episode will be just as informative and thought-provoking as our initial show. Heads up, you're probably going to want to get your iPad or your notebook or good old-fashioned pen and paper. We're going to be bringing you a lot of information. And if you're not prepared or you aren't recording, no worries. We're going to be uploading these episodes to the internet, and you'll be able to rewind and watch and take notes as much as you need to do. With no further ado, let's get started with tonight's show, and I'll introduce our guest. Joining us this evening, we have Ms. Bernita Sykes. Bernita is the local systems manager for early intervention with Henrico Area Mental Health Developmental Services. Her professional career began in the classroom as a middle school special education teacher. However, transitioned to working with adults with special needs in a day support program for Henrico Mental Health. And while attending a training, she met a supervisor of the agency's early intervention program. After hearing about the program's goals and missions of providing services to infants and toddlers with developmental delays, she states she finally found her calling, what she was destined to do with her life. In 2005, she began working as a service coordinator for Henrico Area Mental Health and Developmental Services Early Intervention, and then in 2008, she was promoted to the local system manager for the Henrico area. Bernita has a bachelor's and master's degree in psychology. She recognizes the importance of community and family. She is part of several clinics and early childhood coalitions that ensure all children are healthy, well cared for, and ready to succeed in school. Thank you for joining us, Bernita. Next, we have Ms. Vicki Beatty. She is the owner of Virginia Parent Advocates, LLC. Her destiny and life's passion began on March 3rd, 1995, with the birth of her son, Davis. Within weeks, Davis was diagnosed with a genetic anomaly. In her words, she stated, "We knew we were going to have challenges, but first and foremost, we had a beautiful baby who could light up a room with his smile and laugh." With appropriate services at an early age and full participation in general education classrooms, Davis has superseded all of the professionals' expectations. Her courage and determination have paved the way for countless parents of children with disabilities, ensuring that every parent has a voice and every child with disabilities receives a free, appropriate public education as required by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA. She attended VCU and received her BA in history. And lastly, it is worthy to note, in her words, her desire is to empower parents through special education advocacy. Thank you for joining us, Vicki.
Thank you.
All right, so as I said before, we have a lot of ground to cover, and we're going to start with early intervention because that's where it starts. So, Bernita, please tell us, what is early intervention?
Sure. Early intervention is a program that is designed to help families who have children with special needs. So we work with families or caregivers that may have an infant or toddler that is showing some developmental delays. We provide services in the child's natural environment. The natural environment may be the child's home. The natural environment may be the child's daycare. It could be grandma's house, auntie's house, wherever that child is during the day. Early intervention believes that services are appropriate to happen in that location in the natural environment because that's where the child spends their day. And so what we want to do is we go in, we have therapists that go in and we work with the child, we model, and we implement different strategies that the family can do with their child.
Okay, and we definitely want to touch on those various services that you guys do provide. But before we get there, let me ask you this question. You have a lot of children out there that need services. You have them in very different locations. Some are in hospitals, some are in homes, some are in rural, some have generators, you know, it's just different types of ways that they're living. What is central point of entry? What does that mean?
So the central point of entry is where families can get in contact with us. So every state has early intervention, every city and county has early intervention. So our particular locality, we handle Henrico County, Charles City, and New Kent counties. And so what we do is we serve as like the hub. And so instead of families and pediatricians and hospitals trying to find out where do we send our child, what, you know, we have questions about our child's development, who do we call? Instead of calling the many providers that we work with, we have a central point of entry. So that way we're able to, you know, be available for the children and the parents as they call in.
Certainly. So the families get in contact with you and services are needed. An IFSP is implemented or written up. What is an IFSP for our families who may not understand that acronym, the jargon that we're going to be using? So tell us what that stands for.
So when families come in, if you don't mind, I'll go all the way back to like when they first come in. So many of our families, they get to us in a lot of different ways. Some get to us because they have this gut feeling, something is wrong with my child. And I need to know what it is so that I can get them the help that they need. Some families, while the mother is pregnant, they already know. The doctor has told them, we are concerned and we believe that your child may have a disability. Some parents, they may find out at birth. They didn't know why they were carrying the baby, but when the child is born, they find out that their child has a disability or a diagnosed condition. And so majority of the families that call us, they are coming to us because they've been to the doctor, they've been to the pediatrician. The pediatrician has said to them, ask them questions about their child's development. Is your child sitting up? Are they rolling over? Are they using words? Are they pulling the stand? And all of those types of things that a doctor would ask about, a pediatrician would ask about a child's development. Once that parent begins to say things like, no, he's not doing that. Is he supposed to do that? The pediatrician may say, hey, we have a program, your county offers a program called Early Intervention. We think that you should give them a call so that your child can be evaluated. Another way that families get to us may be through the hospital, the NICU. So if a baby is born and they have to stay in the neonatal intensive care unit for 28 days or more, or if they are born at 28 weeks or less, they refer to us directly from the NICU. So
I'm sorry, let me just ask you a question. I kind of want to go back and let's talk about intake so that we can kind of flow into the services.
The IFSP and everything.
So yes, so what does intake consist
Yes,
of, and how can
sure.
the parent best be prepared, or the care provider, for intake? What types of documents should they have with them?
Okay. So once a family comes in, once a family calls in and we get them set up, or we call them because a referral came to us from the hospital or somewhere in the community, we set up a very important appointment, and that's called the intake appointment.
Okay.
And that leads us to the IFSP, which I'll explain in just a second. But the intake appointment is typically held with the parent or the caregiver present. A lot of times the child may not be present at that intake meeting, because what we're doing is we're trying to gather enough information to see if we can determine if the child is eligible for services. When they come in for that intake, it's important that the family brings any medical records, anything, any screenings that they may have had at the pediatrician's office, anything that will kind of help us know and get a good picture of their child's development and the parent's concern. And what we do is we take a look at the child by using a screening tool. We use a parent questionnaire, basically, called Ages and Stages. And in our particular program, what we do is we mail the family, when they call in or we call them, we mail them a copy of the Ages and Stages ahead of time, so the parent can be familiar with it. We have them to fill it out. When they come in, the intake service coordinator will go through the ASQ, and they will look at the parents' responses. They'll ask questions. They will total the scores up, and they'll get to see right then and there where the areas of concern are. And in addition to that, the service coordinator is collecting the social history, trying to find out where the child is during the day, who's a part of the child's life, what do they do during the day? Are they at home during the day? Do they go to Bible study on Wednesday nights? Do they go to romp and roll? What do they do? And they collect medical history. They gather all of those things together, and at that point, they are able to prepare that information for a team of therapists who will then look at all of that information that's presented to them. And many of the kids, we're able to tell, based on what we have here, based on the screening, based on the social history we gathered, the medical history, the parents' concerns and their priorities, we're able to kind of get a good picture of the child, and we're able to say, we think this child may be eligible for early intervention.
So let me ask you this question. If you gather the information and you have the team that's reviewing the information, what happens if the information provided is ambiguous or not enough to make a fully formed determination of eligibility?
That's a good question. So sometimes it's really clear, it's really cut and dry. So if you have a child that's 2 years old and the parent is saying, my child has no words, not saying anything, it's pretty clear cut. They are delayed. They at least have a 25% delay, which is one of the qualifications for our program. But then you'll have a child who, let's say they are 2 years old, and they may have 15 words, okay? And so they have 15 words, and so the team may say, look at all of these things, I'm not sure if this child's eligible. What we want to do is we want to use a tool. What we use, one of the tools we use is called the Hawaii Early Learning Profile. We call it the HELP. And we may target that area and say, okay, yes, that child does have, is showing a delay in this area. And we do say that that child is eligible for services. And then if it's okay with the parent and they want to move forward, then we start looking at assessment for service planning, and we start to say, okay, that's when we're looking at all areas of development. The parent may only come in with a concern about speech or motor, but we're going to look at everything because we know that everything kind of works together. And so we look at that, and then we tell the parent, this is where your child stands. This is where they're scoring in motor compared to children their age, typically developing children. We would expect a child this age to be doing this, and right now your child is showing concerns in this area. And then based on that, we ask the parent, would you like to develop a plan? And then we make sure that the parent is okay with that. And if so, we develop the IFSP, which is an individualized family services plan.
Certainly.
Yep.
So at what age, and it sounds like I know that you answered it, but just in case some people missed it, at what age can a referral be made? As early as?
As early as 0 months.
As in
so
utero.
in utero. So we serve children between 0 and through 2.
Okay.
So the day before their 3rd birthday is the last day that they're eligible for services with our program.
Okay.
So we want to get in there early as possible because we know that's when the brain is absorbing everything, and a child grows so fast during that time, and every day counts, every hour, everything counts because children are like sponges and they're grabbing on everything. And so we start as early as, mom calls and, something didn't check out right at the appointment, the child had a stay in a hospital, some significant medical history occurred. We want to start as soon as possible.
So let's kind of go back. The phone call has been made. Somebody has reached out to you, the doctor, the NICU, nurses, or mom or grandma. What can people expect as a turnaround time to response to that initial reaching out?
Okay.
Is there like a time frame?
Yeah. So early intervention, we want to make sure that families understand the process, and we want to make sure that we have everything that we need in place to make an informed decision, and we want to make sure that parents' rights are respected. And so we do have a 45-day timeline from the date that the family calls until the date that the plan is developed. And so it sounds like a long time, but if you think about all of the things that we have to get in place and have all of the right people in place so that we can make sure that we make the best decision with the family in mind, that's kind of how it gets started.
We're going to delve more into that, but right now I kind of want to speak about the milestones of a baby and the things that a baby should generally be doing. Every child's development is different, we know that, but generally speaking, and just chime in, at 3 months, the things that a baby should be doing, we're thinking that they should be smiling at people, potentially self-soothing a little bit, trying to look at mom and dad, and cooing and making those cute little gurgly, spitty noises that we love and we just eat up. So that's around 3 months. At 6 months, the baby should know familiar faces, mom and dad and brother and sister, and they should like to play with those who are familiar to them. They like looking at themselves in the mirror. I do too. I'm not a baby, but and they're stringing vowel sounds together and starting with the consonant sounds at about 6 months. And that's the time where kind of everything is going in the mouth. So we have to be very vigilant about keeping things clean off the floor and things such as that. At 9 months old, we're looking at maybe being afraid of strangers, or maybe they're clingy. They should understand no. They're making the mamas first, and then the ba-ba-ba-ba-bas, and so that's the consonant sounds, and the whole peekaboo thing kind of gets them going for hours and hours.
Yes, they love peekaboo.
They're transferring, is that correct? And using like a pentagram, and that's like when they're doing the Cheerios thing. That's okay. At 1 year, what would you say that you would expect them to do? Like cry or cry if their mommy and daddy leaves them?
So as we start approaching 1 year of age, we begin to see a lot of things start happening, and it happens pretty quickly. And so you go from a child who may be crawling around to now they're pulling the stand, now they're walking around and getting into things and all of those things. But there is such a wide range in development. And so, for example, a child a parent may call and say, my child is not walking, he's 12 months old. And there's still a range there. We may have up to about 17, 18 months. That's when we start to really get concerned. Okay, he's still not walking yet. And so there's a wide range in development. And so that's why we look to the eligibility criteria. And we look to see if that child is meeting a milestone, or are they showing a 25% delay, or do they have like atypical development? Is it something like they're doing something, but it's not typical. And then if they continue to do that, then it's going to get them behind in meeting their milestones. But I brought this with me today. It's called Milestone Moments. I'm not sure if you guys can see this, but it's just a small booklet. It's a small booklet, and the reason why early interventionists love this book so much is because it's nice and it's small, and you can throw it in your purse. And for the folks who like to look at things online, they're online, but these can be found at the Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention, the CDC. You can go to their website and order these. But one good thing about this, and the reason why I like it so much, is all of those milestones that you mentioned, they're in here. And so it may say your baby at 4 months should be social, emotionally, should be smiling, likes to play with people, their language begins to kick in, they start to babble and things like that. But then on the opposite side of this booklet, it begins to tell you how can you help your baby's development. So if I was a mom, which I am, and even though I have 2 children, it was almost like every time a child was born in my household, I would forget what is my child supposed to be doing at this time. So this booklet gives you an opportunity, the parent an opportunity to look ahead. If I was going to the doctor and I had a 12-month-old, I would be looking at the 12-month-old page, and I would kind of prepare myself and start gearing myself up, and I would be saying, okay, is he crying when I leave the room? Is he starting to say hi and bye? Is he shaking his head? And I'm looking at this, and so that when I go into the pediatrician's office, I can say, hey, I have some concerns. He's not doing these. We like to have these in all over the community.
Say the name of the book again.
It's called Milestone Moments, Learn the Signs and Act Early. And it's a nice reference for parents and caregivers, daycare providers. This is a nice booklet for them. Yep.
Okay, so basically, as you stated before, early intervention is from in mommy's belly all the way up until the day before the 3rd birthday. We hope that the aforementioned for the milestones that a child should be achieving, that they're met. But if they haven't been met, then we are hopeful that early intervention has been consulted and is working with that child. After the age of right before the 3rd birthday, so right at 3 years of age, then a child can actually be eligible for school, early childhood special education. So enter Vicki. So we just talked with Bernita, and she explained what an IFSP was and how the introduction in the special arena, in the special needs arena, how it all begins with early intervention services. And we know that children with special needs can enter school as early as age 3. So presumably, you could get a phone call from someone saying, hey, I'm having some issues. Have you had that happen to you yet with someone as young as age 3?
Actually, in the state of Virginia is unique in that children with a noted disability or found eligible can actually enter the school at age 2. Okay. That is not normal everywhere. Right. So I have worked with families with children as young as 2 and a half. Okay. It all depends on if they call and if they're concerned. Okay. A lot of the calls that I get are parents that don't know what they have rights to.
Okay. And that's why we're here.
Exactly.
To let them know. So let me, because you did say that, and I have a child with special needs, and he did enter the school system at age 2. So it was that hard pause, putting your 2-year-old baby on a school bus and having them go off to school. Yeah. We transitioned from an IFSP to an IEP. So can you please tell us, what does IEP stand for?
Sure.
And what is entailed with that?
The IEP stands for an Individual Education Plan. And what's really important in that is that it says individual. It doesn't say what the school can do. It's what the individual needs. I refer to it as a blueprint. It is a blueprint on what the student needs to access the general ed curriculum, what supports they need, and every single part of that IEP has a major level of importance.
All right, so last week, we talked about ESY, or the extended school year, and how Heidi Lawyer, the executive director for the Virginia Board, was instrumental, a trailblazer, in having ESY services implemented for her son, Danny, but also for other eligible children coming along later on throughout Virginia. Now, extended school year services, it's a part of the IEP, correct?
Absolutely.
And how do you aid in securing these ESY services if they're needed? And what types of services might you suggest in that category?
And I think this is probably the one area of the IEP that is more mysterious, and it doesn't need to be. ESY is Extended School Year Services, as Shareen said. And what I noticed in the 200 to 300 meetings I've been in the last 6 years is that usually they're only picking one criteria as to whether the student's eligible, but there's really 6, and you only have to meet one. The school divisions sometimes just focus on whether the student is regressing or would regress if they did not have supports and services during the summer. That's only one criteria. The other 5 is there's emerging skills. If all of a sudden they're having, for lack of a better, a burst, an emerging skill. And I use that off of the progress reports. If the progress reports have an ES for emerging skill, that's a qualifier. Degree of progress, if they're not progressing enough, that could be a reason. All of these don't require data, by the way. Which is what we get stuck in a lot with in meetings, is there's no data. Every one of these doesn't need that. You also have severity of disability. My son, who has significant disabilities, would qualify every year under that category. And then there's, I know I'm going to forget one of them, but the one that is like a catch-all is a special circumstances. And that's one that if you've got a family that's moving from one state into Virginia, at the end. It's very open-ended. There is no data needed. It's really how you are requesting the services you want as to get the team to be in agreement. Oh, and the other one, I'm sorry, which was really, really important because of the explosion of students being identified with autism, is interfering behaviors. So if they have any interfering behaviors, that meaning interfering with their progress or their education, that is a qualifier.
So let me ask you a question. You said that the one that's kind of open-ended is if they're transitioning to Virginia from
just an example.
All right. So do you or have you dealt with a lot of military families? I mean, we're right here near Fort Lee. What is that looking like for you?
I really haven't.
Really?
I know.
Well, maybe you will now.
And it's tricky because I see some school divisions where an IEP is a legal document, and if a family comes from Florida, if they come from Hawaii with this document, it cannot be changed unless there's new data. And new data is new evaluations, which takes this extensive amount of time, and the parents have to agree to it. But what I see is school divisions altering IEPs before they even meet the student. And it's very disconcerting.
So if we see that, or if we're concerned about that, we know that we will be reaching out to get information.
Absolutely.
So speaking about behaviors and interfering behaviors, tell us, if you don't mind, kind of expound on what is a 504 plan and how that differs from an IEP, or how that works in concert with an IEP. Are they the same? Are they different?
A 504, well, let's go back to the IEP, as Shareen had mentioned earlier, falls under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And that is a part of legislation that is separate from where the 504 falls under, which falls under the Americans with Disabilities Act. All that said and done, the main difference is that a 504 is only for accommodations. So if you just need, say for instance, if the student needs to be able to take a break whenever they want to. That doesn't require specialized instruction. So if you just need accommodations, it's a 504. If you need specialized instruction, then you need an IEP. You qualify for an IEP. And that instruction, by the way, isn't just academic. It can be instruction on them learning to say, I want to take a break if they're not able to do that yet. That is something that can be taught to them. And I find a lot of, because for some reason, the only disability my son doesn't have is autism. And the majority of the families I work with have children on the spectrum. And one of the comorbidities that just goes through everyone, no matter what, is lack of ability to organize. And organization can be a taught skill using specialized instruction, therefore a qualifier for an IEP.
So are you saying then that a person or child could have both a 504 and an IEP?
I've heard that can happen, but I don't know why, because an IEP includes accommodations.
Okay, so the IEP is you're getting everything.
It's the mother.
Yes.
It's the mother.
It's the golden ticket.
Yes, it's the golden ticket, exactly.
And then the 504 is the accommodations, which is generally dealing with the behaviors and things such as that to accommodate.
No, well, it could be. Most of the accommodations, accommodations are what you need to access the general ed curriculum.
Oh, okay.
So, for instance, I've worked with a gifted student who happens to have ADHD, but he needs to be able to leave the class early in changing classes because too much in the hallway.
Yes.
So he's able to do those kind of things. If there's behaviors, I would be leaning more toward an IEP, because if there's a behavior based off of a disability, the disability doesn't disappear one day. You have the student. No, it does. I don't care what Hollywood says. It does not. But what the student needs to do is they need to learn how to manage it, and that requires specialized instruction.
So in your profession, have you seen an increase in 504 plans over IEPs, or are they par with one another as far as like what you're getting referrals?
Most of the families I work with are IEPs. I have done a handful of 504s. They're not complicated. It's not as legal as it is, and because usually most of them, if you're lucky, are 2 pages long.
Oh, okay.
And they don't even...
That's not an IEP.
No, it is not.
IEP is a little bit thicker.
Yes, they are.
Let's talk about FAPE, free and appropriate public education. It's a right. It's an educational right of children with disabilities in the U.S. that are guaranteed by the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the IDEA. How have you been able to aid your clients in ensuring that their rights as a U.S. citizen are covered?
I always go back to the IEP because it is the blueprint. And every piece of that IEP, I don't mean to be redundant, but is important. And so you have to, in order to get FAPE, you have to have a solid, good, informative, baseline-driven IEP with extremely measurable goals, and that's the challenge.
So let me ask you this question. This is going to be a 2-part question, so I'll give you the first part.
Thank you.
Let you answer, and then we'll go back. How do you ensure that when you're assisting in writing an IEP, that a child is allowed and able to function at their highest level of independence, at their highest, what they're reaching for in their least restrictive environment? We know that parents may want one thing, the school may realistically only be able to offer so much, and then the child within their limits. How do you marry all of that together to come up with a good IEP?
I will say, my son's 22, I will say the generation of parents right below me, the ones that are younger, are much smarter, much faster than my generation. They already are setting higher expectations for their students, and usually what I'm getting is the kickback from the school. So in order to get what the student needs, for one, the first part of the IEP, which is the present level of performance, leads to the next section, which is the goals that leads to the least restrictive environment. Every student, no matter what their abilities are, have a legal right to be educated with their typically developing peers in a general education classroom. Where that becomes the trickiest, for my son that was easy, but where it's tricky is with students on the spectrum who have the ability intellectually to get a diploma because of all of the sensory and all the other things that come in a classroom with 20 to 30 students. But they do, parents, my job is to make sure parents know all their rights that they have. It's their final decision, because it is their child. I'm just there to recommend. But most don't realize that they have that option, and it's very easy to put it's easier to put the students off into self-contained classrooms. But there's something called a push-in instead of a pull-out, and that's the philosophy I like, where the teachers push in to the gen ed class to provide support instead of pulling the student out of the class.
Certainly, and that's what's important with regards to mainstreaming. I want to talk about the second part of my question that I'm going to throw at you. We talked with Bernita regarding what are some of the documents, what are some of the things that are needed when you have that initial assessment completed. With regards to an IEP, what are some of the documents that you may request in order to write out the best plan to assist in that PLOP, that present level of performance? What kinds of things would you ask for? Medical records, I'm presuming, or?
You know, I don't go to the medical records. What I need to know as much as the school knows. So the first thing the very first thing I want is I want the parent to put down in writing for me a list of all of their concerns and what they want. I need to make sure that I am addressing that, not just dissecting an IEP. I need to have, what I always request is at least the most recent evaluations the school system did, including the eligibility minutes and the checklists, the criteria sheets. If they have any outside evaluations that provided diagnoses or updates, those are helpful. I always want the current IEP and with the progress reports, and I usually, depending on the age of the student, will ask for the one prior, because what I come across a lot are repeating goals year to year, and goals are called annual goals, which means they are meant to be mastered in 1 year, and if they are not being mastered in 1 year and they keep repeating them, then I expect to see in the present level all the strategies they tried that did not work, so they don't keep repeating the same thing. 9 times out of 10, that's not happening.
So that sounds very interesting. I know that a lot of parents may not have known that, but it's definitely some good information. I want to talk about children with special needs, very severe, profound, such as David, such as my son Stefon, that maybe mom and dad have been told, you know, he'll never walk, he'll never talk. They lack the ability or the capacity to learn due to the severity of their intellectual or developmental delay. It precludes their ability to learn. It precludes their need for going to school. Tell me how you use the zero rejection policy, which essentially states that no child can be denied an education because they're uneducable, okay? How do you use that rule to help your clients, or even how have you used it to help your son, Davis?
You know, I'm not familiar with that rule, but I'm way familiar with that scenario.
Yeah.
Because I can give you the instance with my son when he was 7, and I realized that my school division had not offered him the opportunities that he had a legal right to, meaning to be in a general ed classroom. The only person who fought me in those meetings was one of the related services providers. And I found out a year later, after my son was successfully transitioned into 100% general education, that she had actually put a note in that file that said my son was uneducable.
Oh, wow.
And because I had a good relationship with the new therapist, she told me that. And I didn't see that as a negative. Now, it irritated me. I didn't see that as a negative. I saw that as a learning opportunity for the rest of the school division, because my son does not read books. He does not do that, but he is an equal member of his community because he has grown up with those other students. He has a right to belong. And that's what I have done with my son. Oh, now I'm going to get all choked up.
No, that's okay, because
but
as a mom of a child with a genetic anomaly as well, Stefon has Angelman's, we've had to utilize every kind of education scenario, from homeschooling, where the teacher would come in, to where he was going to school when he was in the hospital at months at a time, to going to school for just a third of the day or a fourth of the day due to his issues, and all of those things were covered in his IEP, and the school had to accommodate him. So he can't read or write or talk or do those things either, but he is entitled to everything that Davis and all children
And
are.
you know, the other thing with that, Shareen, too, is that when you are not in when you're not in a classroom with a lot of talk, people asking questions, hearing the teacher's lecture or whatever, our kids get what I call incidental learning. It's like learning by accident, just by being in the environment. You don't get that if your kid bangs your head up against a wall, which nobody's here does that, but say you've got a kid who bangs their head up against a wall, why would you put them in a classroom with 7 other students doing the same thing? You're not going to get that other piece. My son went through gen ed almost 100% till 8th grade, and then I took him out of algebra. You know, but just the first time, from what he learned in history, he can go to the Virginia Museum and he can go in his wheelchair and push his wheelchair to the portrait of George Washington and to other significant things that he did learn by being in the environment.
We have a saying. I work for Social Security Disability, and we have a saying, iron sharpens iron. So you definitely want to have your child in an environment where they are socially challenged, where their best is being pulled out of them, and by association. So we should have the right to do that. At this point, I'm going to be going back and forth between early intervention and in-school advocacy, educational advocacy. We're going to hit on a lot of topics, and while it's not important for the viewers to know everything as it relates to early intervention or educational advocacy, it is important to expose you, the viewer, to your rights, to policy, to services, and the law as a parent or a caregiver for your special needs loved ones. So, Bernita, I'm going to ask you briefly, as you can, what is the Integrated Training Collaborative, or the ITC?
Sure. So the Integrated Training Collaborative is an awesome resource for not just families, but also providers. We actually have a website, and it's called Virginia Early Intervention Professional Development website, and it's a collaboration with all types of early interventionists. Parents can see all types of tools, things that they can implement in their homes. We have blogs on it, and we have all types of different training that our providers can stay fresh, can learn new things, and service coordinators can learn new things.
Can EI professionals become certified
Yes.
in certain areas to provide services?
Yes, that is where we go. We get all certified. All early intervention therapists and service coordinators have to be early intervention certified, and so that's what we do. We go through that website and do that.
Vicki, I want to talk about the delicate dance of inclusion and the IDEA as amended in 2004, which does not require inclusion, but does state least restrictive environment must be used to meet the student's unique needs or individual needs. The child's parents may want the child in a regular or mainstreamed classroom setting, but the school, we kind of touched on this, may strongly feel the child should be in a less academic demanding environment. What do you do in that situation? Do you just say, what do you do?
Well, you know, the reauthorization in 2004 may have not included inclusion, but where my child is in a class is a civil right.
Okay.
I mean, I strongly feel that IDEA and ADA are very much civil rights based. It just happens to be based off of disability as to something else. LRE, the least restrictive environment, is always going to be around your typically developing peers. I don't care what you call it. It's and I actually don't even like the word inclusion because inclusion makes it sound like you're getting a benefit. It's a right. It's
So
not a benefit.
That kind of bounces my other question out of the way, because I was going to ask, I want to talk about inclusive education versus the definition of inclusion, but as you just stated, it's a right. So
It's a right, and when you go through, it's important when you're doing a when you're talking about the least restrictive environment, which is the last part of the IEP that you do, and everything else you've done before is what's leading to this, which is why those other sections are important. But when you're doing that, you have to go through what's called a continuum of option for placement, and the very first thing that should be discussed every meeting is general ed. The supports a student needs does not matter. Those supports follow the student. The student doesn't follow supports. You cannot
Say that again.
It is my mantra.
Yes.
The supports follow the student. The student doesn't follow the supports.
Okay.
I also hear a lot, we don't have those resources in the building. And I'm like, I don't care.
Okay.
That's not it. We write an IEP based off of what the student needs, not what you have available. But in going through the continuum of options for placement, the first is always gen ed, the last is always private day. Okay. And then there's a myriad of ones in the middle.
Okay.
But they really need to be able to prove why not. And the only time that I've really seen it where it doesn't work is when the student is on the autism spectrum and the sensory is so intense that the level of noise and just visual clutter is too much.
Okay. Bernita, how can families who may have gone through early intervention services who desire to be part of the subcommittees of the ITC, how can they get involved?
Sure. We all meet together. We meet with the different community programs. We meet with the health department. We meet with individuals from Social Security. We meet with just schools and all of those places, but it's always good to have a parent's voice. Okay. We also have the Virginia Interagency Council, and we actually hold meetings there, early intervention, and it's all of these people around the table, and parents are involved in that. So as we make decisions for early intervention, we always want to make sure that we keep the parent in mind. We're doing a lot of things with the NICUs now to try to make it a more standardized process. And as we sat at the table to come up with ideas, it's good to come up with ideas, but we wanted to hear stories from parents who had children in the NICU and what their experience was. So we had them to share their experiences so that we can consider that as we develop process.
And that is good business. That's great. And again, that speaks to partnership. I know as I was going through early intervention, never having been exposed to someone with special needs, it was like sensory overload. Oh my gosh, what? He has what? What do I have to look at? What am I supposed to do? So once I got connected with and it was called parent-infant education, once I got connected with our early intervention providers, I felt like we were in partnership. It wasn't so, the sky is dark and looming and, it's lightning and there's never going to be any sun. It was like, this is the new norm. Vicki, I want to ask you, let's say you have a client and you're able to assist them in the educational arena, that's your forte, but in your dealings with them, you notice that the family could really use other services outside of your purview. Do you work with other area agencies or organizations that you may be able to refer the family to get the help that you think they presumably need?
Absolutely. Okay. I'm not giving my age, but I've had my own business for 6 years, but I came up through the trenches starting as a parent in early intervention and then going through partners, then working at the Partnership for People with Disabilities for 11 years, and you make those connections. I refer, most of the families I work with are already connected to their community services board, but I have referred families out to REACH, which is the, I can't tell you what the acronym is. But REACH, and they deal with crisis.
Certainly.
And I work with, as well, a nonprofit called Medical Home Plus, and they do a lot of resource coordination for families as well. Okay.
So, Bernita, I just want to ask you, and I know we're going back and forth, but in your bio, when I introduced you, you stated you attended a training and spoke with a supervisor in early intervention, and you knew that this was your calling. I'm curious to know, what exactly was it that was said that pulled at your heartstrings that made you say, this is it?
Well, I started out as a teacher, a special education teacher, and so I remember having children in my classroom, and I was a middle school teacher. So I had children in my classroom, and I would say, if he would have just had something, extra boost or something early on, he probably wouldn't even need me or need to be in his class. And so then I went on to work with adults in the day support program. But when we were in the meeting and she started saying things like, we work with the families in their home. The parent is the expert on their child. We're their coach. We're there to help them. They know what's best for their child, but sometimes we may need to get in there and help them a little bit. And she started saying all of these things, and it just made sense to me, because if 0 to 3 is the best time to impact the child's learning, why not start then? So I felt like I was out of order, so I went back to the beginning. So that's why I wanted to move into that.
So again, it's a partnership from in mommy's belly all the way until the day before the age of 3. And then it continues with education advocacy, working and partnering with someone who may be more knowledgeable than we are as parents, but we are too, like sponges, and we absorb and we learn, and we go back and we pull someone else up. Now, Vicki, I want to talk to you about Olmsted, community inclusion. The settlement agreement of 2012 was monumental for our special needs community. In terms of the vision that you have for Davis's future, what does that look like to you? And are we close to it?
No, not really.
Okay.
You know, I think there's, and it's not a purposeful division, but I think in the disability community there is a division between people who have significant disabilities. They don't have any, you know, my son doesn't have any, he's a great kid, don't get me wrong. I love this kid. He will light up a room quicker than anything, the same as your son. But he doesn't have any ADLs. He has to be completely taken care of. So that part of the population, it's just, I don't see it for.
Okay. So there's still work to be done.
There's work, and I couldn't even tell you. I like to have an answer to everything, and I don't know what that answer is. We're trying to create it within our community.
We are partnering, even though we're focusing in different areas, we're all cohesively working together to advance the disability movement. Bernita, where do you think Virginia is getting it right as it relates to early intervention services?
Reaching out. I mean, we're reaching out to hospitals, and we're reaching out to families, and we're trying to get the word out, because we want families to dispel the myths about development. We want families to not wait. We want babies to get help as early as possible. And so we're getting it right in that sense, because we're getting the word out. Opportunities like this will get the word out. So
how would you like to see EI grow, early intervention, and you know, what do you envision as far as it growing? I know that you're there, you're getting the word out, but how would you like to see it grow, like maybe in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, it is growing.
Yes.
It is growing. We served so many children last year, just in Henrico County, Charles City, and New Kent. But getting the word out to the pediatricians' offices.
Certainly.
I like the way we're heading with the NICUs, the partnership we've established with the NICUs around the Richmond and Central Virginia area and all over the state.
Okay.
But if we continue to head in that direction and continue to partner with them, I think we're on the right path.
Okay.
Yep.
Vicki, trailblazer, warrior, or Obi-Wan Kenobi?
I like all of it.
How do you define yourself? I asked Heidi that last week as well, or Jane. So how do you define yourself?
You know, I do what I do because I'm a parent, and I'm the first person in an IEP meeting to make sure that everybody there knows that I'm not an educator. I've learned a lot, and I learn from IEP teams every day, and I have respect for the folks at the table. I see myself more of a negotiator. We don't like to think that we have to negotiate for our children what they have a right to, but it is. Everything is how you deliver your message. You can be firm without hitting somebody over the bat. And I do think that because of the way the system is, that I think the intent that every educator got into to be an educator for gets lost. And so I jokingly tell parents, we're bringing them back to the water, you know, because they you know, it just can't be, you know, a stamped way of the way we do things. It's important to me that it's done, that I use the negotiating style, just because when I leave, that family still has to be with this team, and if you leave ill will, it's human nature that that's going to stay there, and it's not healthy.
All right, Bernita, I want to go back to you as we get ready to wrap up, and tell us again, what should families expect during an early intervention visit?
Sure. Well, when the therapist comes into the home or the daycare or wherever the child is during the day, you're going to expect the therapist to first sit down and talk with the parent or the caregiver and find out what concerns they have, what they would like to work on, what worked well last week, what didn't work so well last week. Then you can see the therapist observing, offering suggestions, maybe role playing with the mom, and then wrapping up, talking about what do we want to work on next week while I'm not here. And
so
that's kind of
homework is important.
Homework is important. Yep.
So Vicki, let me ask you, if someone does need to utilize your services, how are they able to reach you? How do they find you?
I've been fortunate or unfortunate. In an ideal world, I would be unemployed, but I'm not. I have a website, Virginia Parent Advocates. I've not updated it in 6 years. And
I've been busy.
Well, all the services that are listed on it, I don't do. All I do is just the special education advocacy, because that's just been the big need. I have a phone number, I have an email address, but you can get all of that through the website.
And say it just one more time for our viewers.
It's Virginia Parent Advocates.
Okay, and Bernita, is there a statewide phone number that individuals can access for services, or your address, or?
Yes, if you want services in Henrico County, Charles City, or New Kent, you want to call and ask for our lovely Sarah. Shout out to Sarah, and let her know you want to get your appointment set up. That number is 804-727-8372. And then on the infantva.org website, you can go if you live in any other part of the state, and you want to find out where to call and what number to call, you would go to our website.
Very good.
Yep.
I want to thank you guys both for coming in and sharing with us your skills and your skill set. Our goal, as we stated before, is to advance the disability movement in this generation for a time such as this. We hope that you found the information that was provided for you this evening very helpful. Again, the information, this episode and last week's episode, will be uploaded on the internet if you were not able to capture everything with your notes. And in closing, I just want to say the mission statement for Virginia Parent Advocates, which is to be advocates for parents in assuring their child with disabilities and special needs receive the quality education and life services he or she is entitled to under state and federal law. We thank you so much for joining us. We will be back next week with more information, more advocacy opportunities, more questions that will be answered that have been asked of me out in the community. And we do want to hear from you. We hope that you have enjoyed what we've brought to you today, and we hope that we will see you again next week.